Today we are going to talk about punctuation rules. One of the punctuation clues to reading you may encounter is the comma. A comma is a punctuation mark that indicates a pause in a sentence or a separation of items in a list. Commas can be used in a variety of ways. Look at some of the following sentences to see how you might use a comma when writing a sentence on this slide. Conjunction in compound sentences. The bedroom doors was closed, so the children knew their mother was asleep. For interrupting word, I knew where it was hidden, of course, but I wanted them to find it themselves. Dates, addresses, greetings, and letters. The letter was postmarked December 8, 1945. You may notice a comma that appears near the beginning of the sentence, usually after a word or phrase. This comma lets the reader know where the introductory word or phrase ends and the main sentence begins. In this sentence, without spoiling the surprise, is an introductory phrase, while we need to tell her to save the date is the main sentence. Notice how they are separated by a comma. When only an introductory word appears in the sentence, a comma also follows the introductory word. When listing several nouns in a sentence, separate each word with a comma. This allows the reader to pause after each item and identify which words are included in the grouping. When you list items in a sentence, put a comma after each noun, then add the word "and" before the last item. The Oxford comma is when one adds a comma before the and precedes the last item on the list. This is a style choice and is often optional. You can use commas to list both adjectives and nouns. A string of adjectives that describe a noun are called coordinating adjectives. These adjectives come before the noun, they modify and are most often separated by commas. One important thing to note, however, is that unlike listing nouns, the word "and" doesn't always need to be before the last adjective. It was a bright, windy, clear day. A list of coordinating adjectives, no "and" needed. Our kite glowed red, yellow, and blue in the morning sunlight. A list of nouns, "and" needed. Not all uses of two adjectives require a comma, though. The class was made up of dedicated medical students. Both dedicated and medical describe students, but medical is essential to confirm the type of student, so no comma needs. Commas are sometimes used to separate two independent clauses that are included in the same sentence. The comma comes after the first independent clauses and is followed by conjunctions such as for, and, or but. In conversation, you might interrupt your train of thoughts by giving more details about what you're thinking about. In a sentence, you might interrupt your train of thoughts with a word or phrase called interrupting word. Interrupting word can come at the beginning or middle of a sentence. When the interrupting word appears at the beginning of a sentence, a comma appears after the word or phrase. When interrupting words come in the middle of a sentence, they are separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. You can determine where the commas should go by looking for the part of the sentence that is not essential for the sentence to make sense. In other words, you can take out the interrupting words and the sentence will still be complete and sensible. You also use commas when you write a date, such as in cover letters and emails. Commas is used when you write the date, when you include an address, and when you greet someone. If you're writing out the full date, add a comma after the day and before the year. You don't need to add comma when you write the month and day or when you write the month of the year. If you need to continue a sentence after you add a date which includes the day and year, add comma after the end of the date. Also, use commas when you include addresses and locations. When you include an address in a sentence, be sure to place a comma after the street and after the city. Do not place a comma between the state and the zip code. Like a date, if you need to continue the sentence after adding the address, simply add a comma after the address. Greetings are also separated by commas. When you write an email or a letter, you add a comma after the greeting word of the person's name. You also need to include a comma after the closing, which is the word or phrase you put before your signature. Sometimes no specific rule calls for a comma, yet one is needed to clarify or eliminate confusion. Another punctuation mark that you will encounter here is semicolon. Like most punctuation marks, the semicolon can be used in a variety of ways. The semicolon indicates a break in the flow of sentence, but function differently than a period or a comma. When you encounter a semicolon while reading aloud, this represents a good place to pause and take a breath. Use a semicolon to combine two closely related independent clauses. Relying on a period to separate the related clauses into two shorter sentences could lead to choppy writing. Using comma would create an awkward run-on sentence. In this case, writing the independent clauses as two sentences separated by a period is correct. However, using a semicolon to combine the clauses can make your writing more interesting by creating a variety of sentence length and structures while preserving the flow of idea. You can also use a semicolon to join item in a list when the items in the list already require commas. Semicolons help the reader distinguish between items in the list. Use semicolons to join two main clauses. Don't use semicolons with coordinating conjunctions such as and, or, and, but. The colon is another punctuation mark used to indicate a full stop. Use a colon to introduce lists, quotes, examples, and explanation. You can also use a colon after the greeting in business letters and memos. Use a colon to introduce a list of items. Introduce the list with an independent clause. You can use a colon to introduce a quote. If a quote is longer than 40 words, skip a line after the colon and indent the left margin of the quote 5 spaces, because quotation longer than 40 words use line spacing and indentation to indicate a quotation mark are not necessary. Use a colon to introduce an example or to further explain an idea presented in the first part of the sentence. The first part of the sentence must always be an independent clause. That is, it must stand alone as a complete thought with the subject and verb. Don't use a colon after phrases like such as or for example. Capitalize the first letter following a colon for a proper noun, the beginning of the quote or the list letter or another independent clause. Don't capitalize if the information following the colon is not a complete sentence. Quotation marks set of a group of words for the rest of the text. Use quotation marks to indicate direct quotation of another person's word or to indicate a title. quotation mark always appears in pairs. A direct quotation is an exact account of what someone said or wrote. To include a direct quotation in your writing, enclose the word in quotation marks. An indirect quotation is a restatement of what someone said or wrote. An indirect quotation doesn't use a person's exact word. You don't need to use quotation marks for indirect quotation. Quotation marks show readers another person's exact word. Often, you should identify who is speaking. You can do this at the beginning, middle, or end of the quote. Notice the use of commas and capitalized words. Always capitalize the first letter of a quote, even if it's not the beginning of the sentence. When using identifying words in the middle of the quote, the beginning of the second part of quote doesn't need to be capitalized. Use commas between identifying words and quotes. Quotation marks must be placed after commas and periods. Place quotation marks after question marks and exclamation points only if the question or exclamation is part of the quoted text. Use single quotation mark to show a quotation within a quotation. An apostrophe is a punctuation mark that is used with a noun to show a possession or to indicate where a letter has been left out to form a contraction. An apostrophe and the letter S indicates who or what owns something. To show possession with a singular noun, adds apostrophe and S. Notice that singular nouns that end in S still take the apostrophe S ending to show possession. To show possession with the plural nouns that end in S, just add an apostrophe. If the plural nouns does not end in S, add an apostrophe and S. Don't use apostrophe for plurals. It is a common mistake and easy to find in signs and even newspapers. A contraction is a word that is formed by combining two words. In a contraction, an apostrophe shows where one or more letters have been left out. Contractions are commonly used in informal writing but not in formal writing. Notice how the word do and not have been combined to form the contraction don't. The apostrophe shows where the O in not has been left out. In this chart on the slide, you can see some examples of commonly used contractions. Be careful not to confuse its with its. Its is a contraction of the word it and is. It's a possessive pronoun. When in doubt, substitute the word it is in a sentence. If sentence still makes sense, use the contraction its. Parentheses are punctuation marks that are always used in pairs and contain material that is secondary to the meaning of a sentence. Parentheses must never contain the subject or verb in the sentence. A sentence should make sense if you delete any text within parentheses and the parentheses. A dash is a punctuation mark used to set off information in a sentence for emphasis. You can enclose text between two dashes or use just one dash. To create a dash in Microsoft Word, type two hyphens together. Don't put a space between dashes and text. A hyphen looks similar to dash but is short and used in a different way. Use a hyphen to combine words that work together to form a single description. Use a hyphen to divide a word across two lines in text. You may notice that the most word processing programs will do this for you. If you have to manually insert a hyphen, place the hyphen between two syllables. If you are unsure of where to place the hyphen, consult a dictionary or move to entire word to the next line.